Good.
Whatever.
I'm sorry about the break.
My thought is we get to, I mean, the SATs back.
Yeah.
We get here, I hand it off to you and you.
Yeah. It's putting a little shake to this. All right.
So,
Oh, maybe that's the first one. Yeah, okay. That looks good.
Are you handling the presentation as well?
We're getting that summer color.
All over it.
Which time? Yeah, I can do or I can.
What's the, is this, will I be able to put my notes plug in there, or do I need to join from WebEx, get a presenter view?
I think either, usually a presenter you would put the presentation in there.
Okay, get you one either way.
But I would just do it.
This is right on the color.
Okay.
Took on extra roll, so I was.
And then we'll be looking for
You
some.
get my finance for time.
So that'll be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there's a hard copy for you. Yep. And we can connect you if you've got the computer.
That kind of thing.
Okay, very good.
And then I'm just.
I'm hiring
You open your phone, read books.
No.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Well, this sounds like a good metric of what the college is doing.
Yeah, we're growing our numbers up.
Looks good.
New program, moving more involved.
In the maritime.
Oh, yeah, it's all, that's all I.
Yeah.
But, yeah, we're increasing enrollment in classes and
Right now.
Sarah, can you hear us?
I can hear you now.
Okay, great. Good evening. Thanks for everyone attending tonight. I'm Doug Rader. I'm your chair. Sarah Gardner is not here, had a charter today and is on remotely as co-chair. Let's take a moment before we dive in and just introduce people who are on the committee here today, just so we all know. I think we all know each other, but still, just to make sure that people listening know who's speaking. If you don't mind, just say your name and one phrase for your affiliation. I don't have one besides the Marine Fisheries Commission.
Lisa Ryder, Executive Director for Coastal Carolina River Watch, and we protect the quality of water and quality of life.
Mark Durham, septic system installer. That's it.
Mark Parrish, former commercial fisherman on NC Steel Services.
Mark Sonder, H2O captain, Echo Tour private boat excursions.
Scott Leahy, Carteret Community College, retired Coast Guard and charter captain.
Nathan Hall, UNCS Marine Sciences. And I'm Charlie Deaton, Habitat Protection Supervisor at DMF.
I'm Zach Harrison, Habitat Enhancement Section Chief at DMF.
Great, thanks. So you have all received the agenda electronically. I got a copy in the back if anybody that's here wants to see that. Generally speaking, we've got a couple of presentations and roundtable discussions related to the CHIP. One of the most, in my view, one of the most important things going on in the state of North Carolina this time and every time. And then we'll have a public comment session following that. So anybody that's listening and wants to comment, be ready for that. So you have the agenda before you. Is there a motion to accept that agenda?
A motion.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Second. Scott? Any opposition? Without opposition, the agenda is adopted. Similarly, you have the minutes from our March 18th meeting before you, and you have a chance, hopefully you've had a chance to look through those. With the exception, as always, is if you see anything minor that's wrong that you would feel like is worth correcting, please get in touch with staff directly. Otherwise, we will adopt those, assuming there is a motion to do so. Motion?
Motion to adopt.
Second.
Motion and second. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Those minutes are adopted. So moving way ahead of the agenda into the first focus for today has to do with the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan amendment issue papers that staff have been working on. Zach, Charlie.
All right, thanks, Doug. So yeah, we're going to be going over a little bit of an update for the 2026 Coastal Habitat Protection Plan amendment. We last came to you with a little bit of information on this, I believe, back in March. Since then, staff have been developing and drafting the issue papers that are going to be in the CHIP. We are almost done with them. They are almost ready to be seen. Anyone listening online from the DEQ wide CHIP team, you'll be getting an email from me tomorrow. So for the public, these are coming your way, not tomorrow, but in a few weeks. We're going to give you a quick preview of where things stand, the progress we've made since last time, and get some discussion, some feedback from you guys on this, particularly as it relates to some of the SAB work. Shouldn't be new news to anyone. We update the CHIP every 5 years, working from marine fisheries, coastal development, and water quality perspectives. The 2016 CHIP stands as our base plan. 2021 was an amendment. 2026 is another amendment. So we're just tacking on issue papers to the base plan. And we are currently in the middle of 2026 CHIP development. We held scoping meetings with all of our DEQ divisions, organized the feedback into a framework, reviewed that with the CHIP team and steering committee, and we've nearly finished drafting issue papers now. Timeline-wise, we are here at the end of June almost, so we will be giving a brief update to the EMC at their meeting next month, and then we will, in August and September, be coming to the MFC Marine Fisheries Commission, Coastal Resources Commission, and Environmental Management Commission to talk all the way through the CHIP, ask to take out the public comment. At that point, we're going to come back to you guys again and get one more round of advisory committee input. We'll also be going to the other advisory committees for input from those who are outside the habitat and water quality perspective, and with the goal of final adoption in November. So, chugging along. We initially proposed 4 different issue papers for this CHIP. One on ecosystem-based management for habitats, one on SAB protection and restoration, and one on planning for wetland change in the coming decades. We also proposed one on community engagement that was going to be kind of a cross-cutting chapter. Due to staff capacity and constraints and a little bit of overambition on my part, we've decided that that's not going to be a full chapter. We're going to integrate the ideas from that into the different chapters. So that won't be a standalone anymore, but we're hoping to retain the same information and goals from that. So jumping right into it, the first of those being the ecosystem-based management chapter. We have essentially 2 parts to this. The first half is going to be laying out the plan of integrating ecosystem data in a broad sense into our decision making. So the 2021 CHIP had a focus on improving monitoring of coastal habitats to understand their status and inform protection and restoration efforts. We made some progress there, but the actions that we put forward were largely dependent on acquiring new long-term funding. That's brought us to a space where we're looking for alternative ways to incorporate ecosystem data into our management decisions with the resources we have. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about how DMF currently uses ecosystem data in its management and describe the framework for using what ecosystem data we do have to inform management. We began with having these discussions across our different sections, but one of the larger endeavors we're going to be working with is adapting frameworks like NOAA's Integrated Ecosystem Assessment. So I'm going to talk through that process a little bit here. And the first, it starts with defining our goals and targets. So establishing management goals from the start is important. We're going to use an internal work group to continue developing strategies for decision making and establish goals for the ecosystem assessment here. Next, we're planning to work with our state partners to develop some indicators that we can use to assess the ecosystem. That includes setting criteria and inventorying potential indicators. And thankfully, we're going to be able to build upon work like the collaboratory study that already included a very thorough analysis of physical, biological, and social ecosystem indicators. So a lot of this work's been done for us. We're a little ahead of the curve thanks to that study. And we're going to be doing a workshop with our partners to select the indicators that we want to use and continue to analyze and set appropriate thresholds. Finally, once we have all of our ecosystem indicators together, we can use those to understand the long-term trends of the habitats. We're going to use the threshold for each indicator to score and compile them to evaluate ecosystem status. The goal there being to fulfill the 2021 CHIP. We said we would provide a public-friendly status and trends report. So we are currently consulting with some of the scientists and communication professionals at the University of Maryland who develop these watershed and state report cards. You've probably come across some of them. The Chesapeake Bay has some notable examples. They've done these for a lot of watersheds up and down the coast. So we're looking at this as a potential way to facilitate all the discussions in the internal work groups and that kind of thing we've talked about and come up with a really professional, polished project. So the actions for that section are establishing our goals, going into the process, conducting a workshop with experts and our partners to select those indicators and establish appropriate thresholds, and then work through the process of scoring and developing our first report card. So moving on to the other half of the ecosystem-based management chapter.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there gonna be one report card for the state? Or
That's the way we've envisioned it. Some of them are able to break down, like the Chesapeake one breaks down by water body. We haven't discussed the specifics of what this is going to look like yet, but I know that you work hands-on with a lot of data, so you specifically will bring into this, but if you have thoughts on it, how to approach this, if this should be a watershed-based, would love feedback on that.
I think let's come back to that question because I think it's a really interesting one, and particularly when a lot of the data streams are not uniform based on the funding sources and the focus of various studies through time. And so there really could be some consequences of inconsistencies in information.
Right. In some places we have a lot more data than others.
A lot. And a lot of years worth of, as a first, I'm on Pamela Co-Executive Director. We've been doing that for a long time. A lot of money went into that. So let's come back to that point.
So second half of the ecosystem-based management chapter, looking at strategic habitat areas. So taking some ecosystem data and putting it into management practice here. So strategic habitat areas have been around for a while in our discussions. The goal here was establishing areas that are high quality connected habitats that were identified to protect the biodiversity and ecological function of those areas. So that process was set in 2006 to select strategic habitat areas using a combination of habitat characteristics, priority fisheries, and a set criteria. Then staff used a conservation planning tool that incorporated spatial analysis and expert input to nominate a network of high quality habitats. The validation study where we collectively went into the field to sample for fish in the surrounding habitats to verify these areas are actually more productive. We're going to go through quickly some of the data from that validation study. Bits of this we have gathered before. You'll see in blue on the next coming slides these areas that are in our strategic habitat areas, or SHAs if you accidentally hear me drop into that. Yellow are comparable reference areas we called non-strategic habitat areas. So looking at our first criteria, do strategic habitat areas have the habitat landscape connections that were targeted? So on the left, looking at the number of habitat categories present, that would be wetlands, SAB, shell bottom. You'll see more habitats in the same landscape together on average. And when we look at the total area of those structured habitats, you'll also see higher acreage in SHAs than reference sites. Sorry about that. So question being, another being, do the sites represent a higher ecological function in terms of habitat quality? Strategic habitat areas had higher density of Spartina alterniflora when they had marshes and higher oyster cover. SAB was present only in region 4 and it only occurred in strategic habitat areas, so you're not going to see a comparison for SABs. It was present in both regions and in region 4 only in strategic habitat areas. And when we say region 3 and 4, if we didn't put the map up, region 3 is the White Oak River watershed, and region 4 is the Cape Fear River watershed, roughly plus or minus a couple areas along the coast. This plot here on the right is a rate abundance chart of the fish that were caught to get a better visualization of the diversity, because there's a lot of variance in total catch. Particularly in region 4 in the southern part of the state, we saw that strategic habitat areas had a higher species richness, meaning it went farther out along the x-axis, and strategic habitat areas were slightly more even based on the gradual slope of the line and had a higher abundance of rare species. So there is evidence that our strategic habitat areas are more rich and even in terms of species abundance and thus more resilient ecosystems. So with the 2026 amendment, our plan is to formally present the analysis of the validation study for those two regions. We will also explore the feasibility of using DMF's independent sampling data to validate the Albemarle and Pamlico Sound regions. And we will finally begin to develop non-regulatory management options and strategies that potentially could be attached to strategic habitat areas. So that's all we've got for that and the ecosystem-based management theme. Doug, would you like me to stop for questions here or keep going?
Let's do it one by one and then come back and then together. So if anything's not clear, ask about it now.
So Charlie, I was trying to follow everything you said. Maybe the letters were too small for me to read it from here. So conceptually, high quality habitats versus the lower quality habitats, does that mean that you have sort of given up on the lower quality and you just want to spend your time and resources on the high quality areas?
So the goal of the strategic habitat areas, kind of broadly, was this idea where you have these areas that are especially high quality. They might have lots of different habitats. It might be an area that has seagrass, oyster, salt marsh, and be relatively undeveloped. So part of the thought being, let's protect those areas that are especially pristine and especially valuable to the ecosystem. Not to give up on areas that didn't fall into that category. But what we're doing with this is trying to test kind of like, okay, the areas that came out of our modeling at the computer, at the desktop, did we actually go catch more fish there? And did we actually see like the things that we think make it a higher quality habitat, like lots of different plant communities and things like that?
So those are obviously easier to keep up since they are already a healthier habitat and ecosystem. So in a broad scope and a broad thought, shouldn't we try to get those lower quality habitats to where the higher ones presently are?
Absolutely, yeah. So if we have areas where our habitats are degraded, I think it's really important to be trying to work on protecting them from further degradation and restoring them. I think some of the thought that went into the strategic habitat areas, and this started well before I was here. But I like this line of thinking is, naturally you'll have areas in our coast that have lots of different habitats, provide different value to fisheries broadly. So there's going to be some natural imbalance in terms of habitats that we're calling higher quality in the sense of, part of the testing we're doing here is there more fish? So that's kind of our metric here. Not to say that, an area of sand flat in the middle of Pamlico Sound isn't valuable. It obviously is valuable habitat for a lot of species. But we've been looking at this in terms of how many species can you catch there, how much. So I think I'm talking around your question. Am I getting to what you're?
Somewhat. I mean, it was sort of a broad question that, the elbow is attached to the wrist and, and I see it all as one big area, and hopefully, a fish will swim from here to there,
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily just stay where there is more salve, although in a nursery situation, one would argue that they would stay there, but as adults, it would just be, again, the high quality ones are easier to work with because it's already healthy or healthier. And how do we bring up the rest so that it's one big happy ocean kind of thing?
Yeah.
Can I also add to that? This is more of the mindset of conservation, whereas another part of my section is restorations, but primarily for oysters. But we take those, what would be considered lower quality areas that are more like practically desert or sand flats, and we're building oyster reefs there to raise those levels up and provide those ecosystem services, spat, and all those pieces. And then this is taking high quality. This is looking at, are these high quality enough to be worth conserving? So it's not that effort to restore is totally different from should we protect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Zach.
Well, I think in addition to that, this is just one set of the action items, the approaches that are implicit in this version of the CHIP amendment, which focuses, that includes this, the paper that is looking, the issue paper looking at ecosystem-based approaches and including this as part of that. And then there are other aspects of it too, which we'll hear about next.
So I jumped the gun.
Including SAB statewide as one of those focus areas. Just as a sort of editorial opinion, my view on this is that had we the resources collectively, we ought to be doing that for each one of these key habitats to the extent that we had a pretty good finger on the pulse of the, not just the current condition, but the status and trends and threats and priority actions needed, not just to stem the bleeding, but to identify restoration priorities on each and every one, and also to be able to triage those investments to look at where the differential, the up and down, would make the biggest difference for the overall system. And I believe that's where we're going with the ecosystem part of this. But the CHIP Steering Committee, through the various versions, has been having to prioritize resources by all of the agencies and partners. And so what you see before you now are the decisions that were made about this iteration. But I think the broader question in the longer term are totally fair game. And we ought to look for higher level investments in all of those other things. But that makes it incumbent on us to go raise the political visibility of this set of issues and the resources available, the commitment by the politicians and the people of the state of North Carolina. So, I mean, I think these guys have done an unbelievable job, guys of all genders. They've done an unbelievable job with the resources they have. But they've been kind of, Lisa?
R3 is the White Oak River Basin and R4 is Cape Fear, is that correct? So I have a couple of questions. One, so what could you attribute, they're similar locations, I'm guessing, the Shaw's in R3 and R4. What do you attribute the R4 having higher species richness than R3? And then my other question is, it says that the SAB was present in Region 4 and the Shaw's only. Is that also the case in R3?
I'm gonna shout to Michelle in the back here, who's worked more on this than me. I'm gonna start with your second question, where I think in Region 3 we had SAB in both, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we didn't actually statistically compare the 3 and the 4, so you can't really compare those together because they were done in 2 different 2-year spans. They don't overlap at all. And we've talked a lot about with their fish data, we didn't see as much difference in Region 3. We discussed ideas like, is the morphology of the basins different? Is everything closer together? So we start looking at it more of a individual river system, like break it down a bit more to see if we see that pattern. But there really was a lot of variability between our sampling, and they sampled throughout the entire year, which is really good when you're trying to capture the entire fish community, but it does create a lot of variability in the fish you catch in your year.
Well, yeah, so you mentioned restoration in terms of oysters. Are there also going to be restoration projects proposed for SABs?
We'll address that here
Okay.
in just a few minutes,
I'm
I
getting
think.
ahead of you, sorry.
But the short answer is projects that we run, maybe not yet, but we're laying the permitting framework a little bit. So
I think there's a lot in the background. One of them is this is a snapshot, a relatively modest snapshot. And in fact, don't know what the directionality of arrows would be within these. We don't have any really ideas, right? So there's a lot of questions about how conditions that might affect those outputs are changing, have been changing, are currently, and might change in the future. And then for that matter, different overlays on the current protectedness, protection status of those waters, those habitats in those waters. So if you look at an overlay of water quality delineations, high staying national reserve water, ORW in North Carolina, or other special water designations that carry with them enhanced water quality standards. And then you look at whether or not that translates through the regulations that have been adopted by the Coastal Resource Commission within those watersheds, as to whether there's any existing development difference or not. I mean, I think there's a lot that could be done to correlate this kind of data back to that, but there's no temporal, right? I mean, there's very little temporal.
Yeah, the data presented here are from like a 3 or 4 year period.
Yeah, it'd be also interesting to see, you know, if you're doing restoration, to do restoration in both the SHAs and the non-SHAs to see how, I know I'm kind of getting in the weeds here, but you mentioned relatively underdeveloped. Is that relatively underdeveloped at the beginning of the project and now maybe things are not relatively underdeveloped, or?
So there's definitely been, you look out there and you see there's changes over time, right? Like this started in circa 2006. So it was good to see that with this, the data presented here is from 2017 to 2020, roughly. I might be off on a year there, but essentially we're seeing that strategic habitat areas still have less eroded edge and less hardened shorelines than the reference sites, which was the case when we set out to begin. So they're still in better shape than their reference site comparisons.
Thanks.
Yeah. Other questions before we move on? I have the feeling it might be better just to move on at this point, and then we can come back and put the
Circle back later. Okay. Okay. So moving on to the next chapter, which is our planning for wetland change. So this chapter is going to focus heavily on thin layer placement for enhanced marsh resilience to sea level rise. So thin layer placement is an increasingly popular tool to enhance marshes resilience. It's been used in other states, but not particularly in North Carolina so far, outside of some very small experimental settings. So this is a tool that can be used to build marsh elevation, primarily through beneficial use of dredge material. Sorry, lost my notes here. The process is summarized over here on the figure on the right. So if a healthy marsh is susceptible to drowning and there's a barrier, there's nowhere for it to migrate to, then what we can do is we can take a thin layer of sediment and put it onto the marsh to keep its elevation and habitat characteristics. So the image on the left is one way that that happens via spraying a slurry. There are other ways that don't involve rainbowing it, but this is a pretty common way to do it. So this topic is going to be addressed through the CHIP primarily through development of an issue paper that summarizes the best available science and guidance for thin layer placement. So looking at case studies, information needs, success criteria, and permitting considerations. The paper is also going to incorporate outcomes from our recent thin layer placement workshop that we held in March with resource agency staff. So what we're trying to do here is set the stage for implementation of these projects in the future. So with that issue paper, we're going to go into some of the history and methods when it comes to thin layer placement, literature review, looking at best available science, and some of that's going to cover things like wetland soil characteristics, physics, biogeochemistry, ecology of both plants and animals, elevation changes, tidal dynamics, long-term resilience to projected sea level rise. And we're going to start to look at some of the guidance documents from different states and agencies and nonprofit organizations that have worked on this. So that is all kind of on the practical side. We're going to look at important considerations for the planning and construction and post-construction stages. With case studies, we're largely looking at issues from the East Coast. We're going to bring in a couple from the Gulf Coast where thin layer placement really got its start. And looking at policy and resource concerns, like dealing with invasive species, smothering of existing vegetation, impacts to the mythic communities and nearby SAV, and any potential contaminants. And we're going to integrate information from the workshop that we held back in March. I believe that happened probably just after the March Habitat and Water Quality AC meeting. So we had 44 attendees from 13 agencies, 6 of them being state agencies, 3 federal agencies, and 3 environmental NGOs. So the workshop's goal was for resource agencies, researchers, and restoration practitioners to share and discuss thin layer placement research and implementation, and look at state policies and challenges when it comes to assessing proposals to do thin layer placement projects, and identifying information needs for future policy and permitting. Because if I didn't say it, currently we don't have a permitting process to do this in North Carolina. It can go through the Coastal Resources Commission's variance process, but we don't have a permit to go out there and someone to apply for a permit, go put sediment on the marsh. Sounds like the Coastal Resources Commission is interested in kind of a long-term, let's see what some of these projects look like, and then we might look at rulemaking to make a permit happen. So some of the takeaways from that workshop, there's a general consensus that any future proposals for thin layer placement projects need to demonstrate a really clear purpose and need that needs to be centered around restoring a deteriorating or degraded marsh. Not the goal being, from our perspective, protecting the marshes, that this isn't just a convenient way to get rid of dredge material. There needs to be a clear purpose for it, not just this marsh is next to where I was dredging. So workshop attendees also agreed that projects should be evaluated on a specific case-by-case basis rather than a catch-all approach, particularly given the local and regional variations in factors like tidal dynamics and the potential for the marshes to migrate inland as sea levels rise. And moving forward, it's most likely going to be necessary to establish a collaborative multi-agency network of stakeholders to continue moving these projects and policy forward. So the workshop's results are being incorporated into the thin layer placement issue paper, and for next steps in identifying priority areas where we might be able to be successful with that. So we had initially proposed a second section to the wetland change chapter focused on wetland migration, which I've mentioned a couple times, but essentially as sea level rises, it floods low-lying land. You'll start to see salt marshes creep into forests, yards, whatever's around. So talking about that in a broad sense, we've been hoping to have increased or new land cover data at a 1 meter resolution from NOAA's Coastal Change Analysis Program. That ran behind, so we won't have that in time for this chip development. We will probably get it later this year. So between that and kind of staff capacity, we decided, let's shrink this down. A lot of the information is currently contained in the 2021 chip. So we're going to continue implementing the recommendations that were in there in the 2021 amendment to the chip. And that's going to be really focused on continuing to collaborate with particularly the North Carolina Coastal Federation has led a lot of work on salt marshes and what they're going to look like moving forward. So continuing to work with them, and we've discussed having a workshop or a research symposium to talk about best practices, research needs, and potential regulatory steps to help facilitate marsh migration in the state. So even though it won't feature as prominently in this chip as we planned, we're still going to be continuing to work on the issue. Any questions on the wetland chapter while we're here?
Is there a magic number of how many inches or feet above the high water mark that you are looking to have the elevation of these wetlands?
Like with thin layer placement, with adding sediment to them?
Mm-hmm.
It's really something that's going to need to be done on a case-by-case basis. So the way I kind of think of it is, us at the Division of Marine Fisheries, we want these to be good fish habitat, which means we want a decent amount of water to get onto that marsh. Now, if you're, say, Audubon and you're here for the birds, a lot of the birds like that really high marsh habitat that only infrequently gets flooded. So I think it's going to depend on the needs of that specific marsh and the stakeholders who are trying to make these projects happen. And there's some amount of trade-off involved in where exactly how high you put that sediment.
So the question is, what's the definition of need, I guess? And can that be measured in inches or feet?
Yeah, so one idea we've discussed is, if someone comes to us and says, I want to put sediment on this marsh, and we ask what's the need, should we go back and look at projections of sea level rise and say, okay, you're looking at another foot of water or so in 30 years. So how much should we kind of benchmark the amount of sediment to that? And what's the outcome? Are you trying to preserve the high marsh? Are you trying to preserve the low marsh? And yeah, there is an elevation target, I think, that's going to be a part of any proposal here, where we should be aiming to hit a specific target. Now, what we hear all the time is that, as nice as that sounds in practice, it's hard to stick at 6 inches of sediment over a whole marsh for anything bigger than about this. When it comes to you're trying to do an acre, to expect a decent, it's going to be hilly. There's going to be variation. So one thing that we don't have an answer for yet, but we're trying to figure out how to consider is what range of elevations are we going to have, and what range of variance is acceptable. So we don't have answers to that part yet.
I do think there's some interesting questions about where it's headed too. And I think thankfully from this standpoint, we're at the pilot project scale, and for that matter, policy correction scale stage, meaning whatever systematic permitting processes need to be vetted and then implemented really have to be identified at the same time that we're moving forward with getting 1 or 2 or 3 of these things in place here so that we can actually judge what happens. Because if you start thinking the scale of what happens, then there's a whole set of secondary questions, just like with beach nourishment. Is there a beach quality sand is a rare commodity globally, increasingly rare commodity globally? Well, what about marsh elevating quality sediment, whatever that even is? You're trying to match what's already there, the organic content, the sediment grain size distributions. If you are, there's not a lot that's not already on marshes. There's lots of it, and you can't minimize the habitat value of the non-vegetative benthic sediments that would otherwise be the only source for a lot of that kind of stuff. So at some point, we need to figure out what kinds of questions need to be asked and answered in order to take this and other similar approaches to scale. I would just observe that that's a 2031 or 2036 kind of project, kind of time frame. But we have to take these steps now in order to begin getting. Otherwise, if we're looking at wholesale loss of marsh over 30 years, or 50 years, and you can only migrate. I have no idea what the migrate, what an aggressive target would be for successful migration. What's the relative role for this active intervention? My belief is it takes a combination of both. I guess we'll find out. Questions?
Yeah, it ties in with this and a whole bunch of the other chapters as far as the chip itself. So just as we talked about the nourishment of the wetlands, will the chip have recommendations, like, because I don't know if it's been published yet, or established, hey, this is how you did it, like within it. So if a contractor goes and says, or there's an entity that wants to do it, is there going to be recommendations or the resource on how to do it? It's something I've run into academically for like living shorelines. How do you actually build a living shoreline? So would there be recommendations or a guide to go to within the CHIP, or is that not part of the CHIP's role?
So Derek, you can chime in if I misstate this, but I think you're probably going to run into some of the same frustrations with this. And
Okay.
I think where we're going to go, where we have gone with this chapter is we focused on some of the ecological considerations, the considerations that we as, agencies who review or in coastal management's case, grant permits, like the things we should be considering as we look at this. And we decided tentatively anyway, you could change my mind on this, but with the construction, the contracting, the nitty gritty details like that, there are a couple guides out there. We kind of left it at, we're gonna say these guys are here, here's a couple that exist, and not try to summarize that within this chapter of the shift. But I'd be curious on your thoughts, as someone who works in the living shoreline sphere.
I think, it's because just the living shoreline, there's not a lot of guidance. It's something we've been working on with the school to work with NOAA and Sea Grant to create an actual guide on how you do it for contractors and for regulation. And I didn't know if that's within the goal of the chip, to say, here's our recommendation for sedimentation or add, we don't recommend you dump 2 foot of sand on top of a marsh because it's going to obviously drown it, but unless it's written, it can cause back effects of someone doing that and adding the wrong type of sediment or over sedimenting an area that killed it, and now all of a sudden they fall back on the chip saying, well, we did what the chip said. To allow some regulation to be formed in the future.
Yeah. And I think maybe the comparison point is maybe where living shorelines were in like the early 2000s.
Absolutely.
Or something. And so I think we're at I don't know that I would be comfortable saying prescribing elevations and things in this version of the chip, but I do think.
But the workshop or a subsequent workshop might lay out the need for such a manual, technical manual, for the user's manual. Also the need for a programmatic EIS or programmatic permit that's already agreed to within the agencies, the authorizing agencies.
Because
that's what the policy and program needs, priority might be.
Yeah, I would just take it as a lesson learned from living shorelines, as long as that's been included within the chip, that it's still not defined by anyone as the best practices. There's a ton of research been done, but it's never been put to best practice. And I think that it could be worded as such in the chip that it would lead towards that in the future, so that we wouldn't run into that same stopgate of why people don't do living shorelines and why they wouldn't correct this in the future.
Yeah, I think leading towards that's important. I mean, one of the early just last year cases where someone was interested in some thin layer replacement, like going through the CRC variance process, they got to getting a contractor in place, and once all the details were coming together, it was going to be prohibitively expensive and complicated, and there's a lot of that information that hopefully at some point we have up front. It's a little easier to navigate and understand like what's involved in the process of getting from an idea to project on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems like we're taking an inverse to what we studied 30 years ago. It was exactly the opposite. We were trying to eliminate this type of situation because we had turbidity loads and everything coming off watersheds and everything like that, and essentially covering our marshes, because the natural flows and stuff like that, the silts and everything are getting deposited onto marshes, so they're naturally growing as the tide rises and the water level rises. So 30 years ago was when we started outlawing that. The marshes are being covered up and being sprayed and everything else back then, and a lot of study was done to see how much could it stand. So it seems like you need to go back and look at the original data that was done then and implement it into what you've got now. Because there's a lot, there's 40 years of data available that case studies are done. So to say we don't know, yeah, we do know. There's only so much Spartina can take. Yeah, and with any other marsh grass or anything. That's the reason why that particular grass grows in that particular place, or it dies out, or a new one comes in. So, you know, and this is one thing I keep pushing about, you know, when I study coastal ecology and everything. The marshes, barrier islands are all having a natural movement. No matter what we want to do about it or anything, it's always going to change. Good example is Buxton right now. You know, Buxton 20 years ago, much wider, but now they, you know, sand has stopped flowing. You know, the little drift is cut off. So Buxton's paying for it. The same thing with the marshes here. You know, we've got sea level rise. I've seen it in my lifetime. But to go ahead and say, well, you know, you can cover that marsh, what's going to be the outcome?
And I think what we're hoping to do with this chapter is to kind of confine, right? Like you said, there's only so much that a marsh can take before, you know, all of a sudden that's not Spartina growing there. That's a juncus or a cedar tree if you went way too far.
Yeah.
So I think part of the guidance, and I don't know that we get to numbers of 3 inches of sand or whatever it is in this edition of the CHIP, but I think the guidance we're trying to get to is for the marshes where the sea level rise is outpacing that sediment. What can you add to it?
Well, the biggest thing is, you know, the dynamics that are involved. And those dynamics constantly change. You know, what was a low tide, you know, low flow marsh system, a hurricane comes through or something like that, all of a sudden it's become huge tidal flood. And it changed the complete, you know, everything complete. So that has to be assumed into the equations of what, you know, being done. You know,
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Sarah.
I'm sorry, haven't attended online before to ask a question, but it feels like we're kind of getting a little bit into the weeds when it comes to thin layer placement. Would it be helpful for our group to maybe have somebody from the Coastal Federation come in and talk about the North Carolina Salt Marsh Action Plan? Because it sounds like we're talking about a very small part of what can be done for our salt marshes, especially when it comes to how much marsh we may be adding due to rising water. We haven't talked about that, and it sounds like we are expanding our marshes in North Carolina in a lot of places, and it just seems like we might be needing to focus on a bigger picture here when it comes to marshes and when it comes to the CHIP. And I would say the same thing for SAVs. That AppNet just posted a paper very recently about SAVs in North Carolina and where we're losing them and at what rate, and how this compares to other parts of the country. And it just seems like it would be really helpful for all of us, I think, to maybe even have somebody from AppNet come in and maybe somebody from the Coastal Federation and talk to us specifically about what they're doing, because it just seems like we're starting to, I don't know, what is it? Pick it a very minor. It's not minor at all, but we're getting really focused on one thing here, and there maybe the information may be out there already that could be helpful. So I don't know if that was a question or not, but maybe the question is, can we have maybe have somebody talk to us about SAVs from AppNet and maybe Marsh from the Coastal Federation. Done.
Please, I don't know if you have any responses about the Salt Marsh Action Plan. So I think that all that is possible, Sarah, and probably needs to be done. My view again on this, given where we are in this version of the CHIP is going to be done in the fall.
Right.
That it would be too late to retool the direction of these particular issue papers and action steps. So we can dive way into those. But the way to think about it, I think, has to do with beginning to fill the toolbox for the future with those tools that are most likely to be necessary without yet going into those other steps. And as you suggest, this committee is, I think, well positioned to begin now thinking about what those further additional steps might be. I mean, one that bugs me all the time, talking about where things stand on wetlands in North Carolina, is the wholesale chaos that's been induced by this U.S. Supreme Court and our legislature on wetland definitions and wetland regulatory programs that are otherwise very well understood and well and effectively implemented. But what happens now with all this sort of kind of pivot, excuse my French, bullshit, when it opens things that we've assumed to be relatively safe to wholesale redevelopment and alteration in terms of land use. So we're talking about marsh migration to where? I mean, you can look at it geomorphologically, but if you look at what's going to be there when that marsh moves, as these wetland definitions are changing, we'll take a lot of that relatively low-lying ground that is not today contiguous with surface waters or existing splashable type wetlands, and that'll be back open for silviculture and all the other kinds of things that would be outside the regulatory purview of the Corps and the U.S. and EPA and North Carolina, DWQ, and everybody else. So, I mean, I think there's huge policy problems there, and with each one of these things that we have to address. It would be useful to begin thinking, Sarah, about the 2031 chip, recognizing it takes years to get these things together and come up with an initial set of questions informed by what happens this time to try to get moving for that time. And for that matter, getting our academic partners excited about answering some key questions. Maybe we can find funding to get some of those questions answered along the way. So I'm not trying to minimize it at all, Sarah. I think it's a great idea to get experts in or people that know about the processes that are underway that we maybe more than we collectively do to leverage along the way. But I don't think we can dovetail it very well into what we have before us now.
Then I do have a quick question then about that.
Am I wrong first, Charlie, about the process? I mean, we would be hard pressed to go far away from what we have, right?
Yeah.
Right. Adding another something in here is probably not realistic. You know, we can work with what we have a little bit, but if you were like, I actually want you to create a whole nother chapter on whatever, soft bottom or something like that, we would do it, but we wouldn't be happy about it.
Wetland regulatory changes.
As much as I wish we had the staff capacity to tackle more papers, we don't. But
well, just
wetland
and maybe we
changes,
can, if we run out of steam on this before the agenda is done, I mean, maybe we can grab some of those ideas today. One that I keep hearing about from people on the water is the siltation that's occurring in primary and secondary nurseries, non-vegetated sites now, from aggregating land use up in the watersheds. And the amount of flocculent soft crap that is ending up down in the creeks, both hurting fishermen trying to fish in those places, but also tremendously changing the bottom. And I don't know if we know that much, if that phenomenon is well documented and or not, and whether there are management schemes that you might think of, or pilot programs you might think of. Maybe that's a potential source of sediment. Let's put it back where it came from, in one sense, right? If you had a set of programs that might, I have no idea if that's appropriate sediment or not, for salt marshes or brackish marshes.
I had I appreciate the comment about the funding mechanism, because I think that's gonna be crucial for anything that we're talking about in terms of the chip. But if this is gonna be the section that we discuss wetlands comments for the chip and not having seen it, so I'm sure there's something about this being addressed in there, but I would really like the plan to measure in terms of wetlands more than just total acreage. I think, that's great. That's great information to have, but we really need condition, ecological function, fragmentation, the conversion to open water, things like that, I think are gonna be really important. The availability of landward migration corridors. Yeah, I just think that it should be more than just the total number of acreage, just the functionality of what's happening, I think is really important. I think it's great what's happening with shoreline restoration, but I've also seen some shoreline restoration projects that don't look like they're functioning well. And so to count that as total acreage, I just feel like that's not the full picture, if that's helpful.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And we could certainly be sure to think about things like condition and that sort of thing with, it's more than just acres.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have a quick one.
No, please.
Along with the migration, rising sea level, is there anything within the chip that addresses the property line? Because as it rises and the marsh is to migrate up, that changes the property owner's current definition of where they own to.
Mm-hmm.
Is that migration being addressed, because that also limits the public trust side of it, being whether it's access or what we're legal side of it?
Yeah, not in the chip.
Okay.
I'm happy to chat about what that
Yeah,
practically looks like from the regulatory perspective, but not going to be in the chip.
Okay.
Is it not addressed in the previous iterations of the chip, the bigger documents?
I don't know that we've touched
I don't think it's in
on
there.
property and the private public trust line in previous chips.
Okay, well, I think that's an important thing to put in the pin for consideration
Yeah,
for next time.
Future comment,
Yeah.
Well, it's a big deal. I mean, if you look at loss of private land to public status through time, that, in my view at least, ought to provide impetus for the General Assembly to invest in helping the public trust as it shifts through time, and for that matter, helping landowners as they lose assets to the public. And that could be a pretty compelling political argument, I think, in terms of getting people to care and also investments to be made. But facilitating that process of the transition from private to public ownership as high water.
The conversation we've had kind of in the context of wetland migration work of, we haven't explicitly written this down, but it's, how do you help landowners as, particularly in places, whether it's Eastern Carteret County, Hyde County, Dare County, where you have lots of marsh moving into the yard, like, what does a landowner do about that? Helping them adapt to it, helping communities plan for it. A lot of questions we've been rolling over in our head without good answers yet.
I hate to even think about where
sticking
this
with that
goes.
for sure.
You think about the definition of joint and coastal waters and inland waters, and authority of the commissions, as big a fight as that already is, if you now say that it's changing, and then what process do we use to look at future coastal joint and inland boundaries based on future salinity patterns? Let's say Roanoke Inlet, the old one blows back open, and the salinity boundaries are somewhere different, completely different. There's all kinds of policy implications.
Yeah. A lot of interesting questions, and then some of this is what drove some of the interest in this too. So even what doesn't make it into this chip is still, a lot of these questions are still on our minds for sure.
It'd be fun to think about recapturing some part of, a process to recapture some part of the chapter that you won't write. Is this sort of policy implications related to marsh migration? I know some of that is presumably underway in the Steps Action Plan. Actually, I don't know what the next steps in that process might be. But this group would be an appropriate one to recommend those kinds of actions.
So over a year ago, we had a lot of discussions about salve, and that even went into the bottom trawling for shrimp and the importance of both items. But we talk about time as a time to put something into another chapter. So shouldn't salve be
Move on to that.
a big part?
I think that's a perfect segue.
Oh, did I lead you?
You, this,
Well done. It's not keeping us to the point.
Okay. Sorry.
Many interesting things.
Oh no, that's perfect. So yes, speaking about submerged aquatic vegetation. So the third chapter of the ship's SAB protection and restoration, and as Sarah alluded to just a few minutes ago, APNEP put together an updated report on extent and distribution of SAB, specifically the high salinity, the seagrass. So this is not going to do that report justice, but the quick kind of takeaways here are that we're losing a little over 1% of our high salinity seagrass per year. This is looking at data from 2006 to 2020. We've lost over half of our continuous seagrass meadows as those meadows transition into patchier SAB. So looking at the figures here, going from left to right, goes from 2006-07 to 2013 to 2020. And the dark green color is continuous SAB beds, and the light green is patchy. So you'll see over time that those continuous beds have been transitioning to patchy beds. And losses are concentrated, or especially notable along deep edge of the SAB beds. So if you think about the beds that grow on the back side of the Outer Banks, that's kind of the western edge as the sound gets deeper. Also, there's a lot of spatial variability here, like some parts of, particularly south of this area, Northern Core Banks to Ocracoke lost a lot of SAB at up to rates more like 3% per year. A lot of that was associated with the widening of Hatteras and Ocracoke inlets and some of the storms that rolled through. So there's some site-specific changes like that that are leading into these numbers, but we have this background of around or just over 1% loss per year, which might not sound like a lot, but when you look at 30 years at 1%, that's 30%. So it adds up over time, and this is kind of consistent with other estimates of SAB loss for the state. So with this headline of seagrass beds are disappearing and becoming patchier, the question is what are we going to do about it? So 2021 CHIP really focused on addressing water quality issues, and that's still the big one for us. So the nutrient criteria development plan team at the Division of Water Resources took the last CHIP's recommendations on light penetration through water to enable enough light to reach down to seagrass. So there's one proposed standard for low salinity seagrasses and one proposed for high salinity grasses. And so that has been moving through the ever so slow process to get to a vote at the EMC. So it's gone to the Criteria Implementation Committee, which is feeding into a fiscal note that the division is developing. So much delayed, but we're looking at this reaching the Environmental Management Commission likely 2027. So continued collaboration on this is our biggest issue. And I'm going to spend the least amount of time on this, despite it being our most pressing issue, because it's short, straight to the point. We need a regulatory solution for water quality for our seagrasses. So while we're working on the water quality piece, we're going to try to work on a couple other pieces at the same time. So one of these being looking at active restoration. With the CHIP, we've traditionally talked about SAB restoration in a passive sense, right? You take away you improve the water quality or you take away the physical stressor that is making the seagrass not grow there, and you hope it comes back on its own. There's growing interest in active restoration, so going out there and planting seagrass seeds or transplanting live seagrass out there. So this edition of the CHIP is looking at the permitting framework for that, which has historically been a little unclear. And we've been working with partners at the Nature Conservancy on that. And we're going to be putting that in the context of some of the ecological and practical considerations for this, where active restoration may or may not be appropriate, because it's one thing to be able to do restoration, it's another to be able to do it in a place and in a way where it's going to work and not be a waste of effort, right? So I'm going to go over some very quickly our preliminary overview of some of the regulatory framework. And just to note that this is preliminary, don't treat this as official guidance. Don't go out and try to restore SAB tomorrow without coming to talk to us first, please. We'll have it a little more shaped up when we have a draft for you. But based on our current permitting framework, it seems like land-based culture of our submerged aquatic vegetation plants is something we can permit with an aquaculture operator's permit and collector's permit. So in water culture of SAB via bottom leasing, similar to shellfish leasing, is something we don't have the ability to permit right now. And if you have more questions about that, ask Zach. But it's going to require legislative action to enable something like that. Seems like same trip collection and transplanting. So if you wanted to go pick up SAB from over here to move over here for a restoration project, that seems to not require any permitting. Now there's some practical considerations as to how effective that would be given the scale you'd be working with, but seems to be doable without a permit. And there are limited protections available for restored SAB beds. So we don't have any kind of authority to a DMF to say that area has been restored, you can't enter it. In terms of protective structures and signage, that's going to require consultation with the Division of Coastal Management and the Army Corps, and potentially other DEQ agencies would also be involved. Not that it's a no-go, but that's going to be something we'll have to approach on a case-by-case basis, and we may have a little more information on that front to include in the CHIP when we get there. And a few additional concerns that we may be able to address through conditions in AOPs and things like that is limiting donor bed impacts from harvest for restoration. We've had a few researchers come to us concerned about the impacts from potentially over-harvesting existing beds to try to restore somewhere else. So we're trying to figure out ways to address that and potentially setting some expectations for monitoring of donor beds. There's some potential issues when it comes to transplanted sources where you could increase disease transmission, could accidentally introduce invasive species like hydrilla or Eurasian milfoil. And there's some questions about if from a genetic perspective, do you want plants that are adapted locally, or do you want to source from a slightly broader area to increase your genetic diversity? Especially in low salinity areas, it'll be important to coordinate with aquatic weed control treatments, because the last thing you want to do is restore your SAB where they were going to come spray for invasives. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Zach for the last piece here.
So the last piece of the SAB section is more physical potential impacts, and this one is more towards a policy side, which is why it's kind of come to me as opposed to from the CHIP team to lead. And so this is following up on the motion from the commission in 2023 that was basically removing any action of SAB protections from the shrimp FMP and requiring or directing DMF to start evaluating, exploring, and developing SAB protections from a more holistic view with the help of this committee. And so what we originally kind of came from that, and what we've then rolled into the CHIP to initiate that process, is first summarizing the commission's SAB protection to date. And so that is some of our analysis of what MFC has done, along with Riley Reagan's work at APNEP of SAB protections from a statewide standpoint. and then doing more of a policy analysis, summarizing the statutory regulatory authority of the commission. And so really evaluating what is the breadth of that MFC authority and what can be regulated, what is under kind of the umbrella of the MFC. And so through that evaluation of kind of the breadth of the authority is where we got to the understanding that this is broadening a bit to not just SAB, but habitats in general, as Dr. Rader said earlier, is the idea of kind of a tool in the toolbox to be able to look at impacts. And then from there, we can explore the potential for habitat-based rule frameworks for this. And so, for example, a piece that Charlie just mentioned is the idea of restoration of SAB, which currently is attempting to occur throughout the East Coast, and Florida is making a big push with that with restoration leases, but there's not a successful route to doing that currently with SAB like there is with Spartina. And so that slowed us down. But if that were to take off, there's nothing the MFC has existing in management to say, you know, these areas behind the Outer Banks have been hit by a storm and need to have further protections on harvest for restoration efforts, as opposed to behind Shackelford Banks or any ways to manage SAV as a species. And another example of that, Dr. Rader brought up in our last meeting of this committee is aspects pulling out from the inclusion of designation of the DORAs in the Oyster FMP Amendment 5 that was adopted last year. There is nothing that allows for the protection or management of shell bottom. For instance, if we were to evaluate DORAs and find areas that have shell matrix but no existing oysters on them, there's no ability to further protect those, especially in an instance where it's not going to affect the fishery if there are no oysters there, but the matrix itself has an ability to recover into a functioning ecosystem. So a lack of management tool to be able to protect things in a way that can be helpful for a habitat and really building back up these, as you mentioned, maybe lesser, not directly high value areas, but could certainly lead to being or recovering to high value areas. And so exploring potential frameworks and rules that are habitat minded, that could house rules and that could provide a management tool for the commission to evaluate habitat impacts. And then as a result of that, look at completing a rulemaking issue paper and present management options. This is following adoption of the CHIP, which would be 2027 with a goal of notice of text by May of 2028. So it'd be a lot of the work the next year evaluating that, and that would certainly this kind of segues into our next part of the agenda. And just to give a little context is a big part of that, we're not looking to propose or figure out SAV protections tonight, but to start the idea that if we're looking at rule frameworks for habitats, including SAV, an evaluation and just trying to figure out what that would look like is something that would take a lot of public comment with user groups, with the commission, with general public. And so a proposal we've kind of had as we are tasked to work with this committee is to have this committee be somewhat of the kind of sounding board, housing base for these conversations, to at least bring back what coordination and what conversations we've had regarding potential rule frameworks as we get down that rulemaking issue paper process to then work out with this committee. And so that's kind of the first piece of the agenda, not necessarily something we have to discuss right this moment, but as we're discussing this SAV portion, that's part of the goal here, is to follow that motion as making this committee, help responsible along with the division to be evaluating what these things should look like.
I have a question. Anybody else before we move into that discussion? Well, I'll just jump in. So the question that this continues to raise for me is the cascading obligations of the three commissions that are together author the CHIP and approve the CHIP. Since the MSC will find it has limited authority over the development and non-development activities that might lead to the kinds of losses of habitat value that we're talking about. And the cascade of initial steps from the MFC to the EMC to the CRC, which is the way I see it most often happening. Let's just say a primary nursery area identification and protection from fishing to designation of nursery areas becoming ORWs and high quality waters, and then bringing with it additional water quality standards, and then that bringing with it additional development standards within the watershed that might go pretty far down the road to doing that is also banked here. So like, for instance, on SAB, we end up with habitat-based rural frameworks for some things under the MFC's authority, but not other things. And for instance, we talked about motorboat, who has authority for motorboat. And we talked about water quality. So let's say that the EMC adopts a water quality standard as we have together proposed for North Carolina generally, or for some areas that might be designated, let's just say SAB habitat, equivalent to what we've already talked about, or something else. Then the pathway there, if we simply say, it's done, it's adopted, is really arcane, because what has to happen, I think, is that water quality standard has to be violated, and violated routinely, in order for uses not to be obtained, the non-attainment designation to occur before an action is necessarily required. And so rather than, and that goes not from 2027, but from, let's just say 2030, 2035, some other time, if we right now identify what that cascade might look like. In other words, what do we know about how one might need to regulate development uses and other uses in watersheds that are directly tributary to SAB habitat, not SAB beds necessarily vegetated, but at map, and as we've already talked about. What would we imagine would have to be done in order to make that proposed water quality standard action in terms of changing land use patterns and things like that? So you see what I'm getting at?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, I don't know if that's part of this next discussion, or if that's, how do we get to the inadequacies of the MFC's authority in terms of addressing the ultimate causation of violations of those cause and effect relationships?
Well, that's a big question, but I think that the cascade of effect of part of that is the function of MFC defining those pieces that then get pulled into EMC and CRC rule for further protections. So, one of the biggest protections Charlie's group uses is in CRC rule, but relying upon SAB definition and MFC rule. So there are those pieces that.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that would require a proposed permit advised process to implement piecemeal, right? And so at some point, I think we can anticipate the problems that are more than project based, and look at deficiencies in the existing governance fabric and already call those out. And I guess where I'm going is not that we have to delineate all of those in this version, but rather, we already know we're going to be 2027 when we at best, when we have the water quality standard. Well, what should we be thinking about in terms of the time from 2027 to 2031 to be able to identify those next steps and get them right for action in the next year?
Yeah, and what I was trying to get at there is that we do have an inherent cascade that exists, but then this, this section of the SAB portion is going to be evaluating what MFC can do, and then part of the goal of that is to look at what power that's not being currently used that the MFC can certainly use exists, and then from there build that out to then be working with DEQ along with the other commissions to understand what are maybe synonymous but slightly different methods that we can be looking at, including evaluating incoming regulation that's geared towards SAB protection, but what does it actually look like? So I think this is one little function of this is to set the stage to understand, statutorily, here's where the MFC stands and what they can do. And from there, we can build off of it as far as further evaluation at EMC and CRC. And the tricky part with that from a, nuts and bolts side is that the primary writers of the CHIP are DMF staff. So that's going to take some more coordination with other DEQ staff and other legal counsel along with those commissions and otherwise to get understanding.
Frankly, again, this is a personal comment, but I would hope that the department senior staff would see this as an opportunity to build the kind of connections between these commissions towards concerted action that's needed. I mean, I know that I'm not imputing their commitment to this. It takes resources, as you say, and resources in a timely way relative to actions that would need to be taken. But this is the right time, I think, to identify what the process ought to look like to take the outcomes that we'll be able to establish now and make them real over the 5 years to come. Anyway, I'd love to see something like that. Other comments or thoughts?
And I think that process should include the political process as well. You had mentioned that for the in-water SAB via bottom leasing, you need a state legislature to sign off on it. So that should be also a part of that that process. Because, I mean, for instance, for this year, there's no way to get it on their agenda for 2026 for the state legislature, either the Senate or the House. So we're already looking into 2027. And so I, again, follow everything Doug is saying.
Maybe even the following long session, but it's going to take that kind of.
Yeah, I mean, the politics should, I guess, sadly be a part of this since they need to sign off on it. And you would figure that it should be a no-brainer, but politics can be a brainer.
Zach, do you want to lead us back to what discussion you think we should have in this this session of the agenda, or are we there? I'm confusing myself.
No, I think we are there. Is really wanted to kind of highlight and get y'all's feedback as, what is your take on kind of being the sounding board as we move forward with this rulemaking effort and, either both collecting public comment during these committee meetings, but also staff bringing the comment that we've had through other user groups and otherwise in the meantime to kind of get an idea and get feedback as to what y'all think proper protections might look like.
I guess, Sarah, I don't want to speak for you, but I think both of us, well, anyway, because I think both of us really look forward to that presentation as it comes to the Marine Fisheries Commission so that we can really look at the things we can and can't do and what would be required. And I'm sure there'll be discussion and opportunity for input going forward on that around the board. But I do think this is the right approach. Did you want to comment, Sarah, on that issue?
I would just add that if you could give us just a little, maybe a wish list of things that you would really like for us to work on within the commission, that would be great. And I would add too, and we've written letters before to various organizations through the commission, but would it be helpful for the Marine Fisheries Commission to write a letter to the CRC and EMC and just say we're really struggling with being able to advance the CHIP if we can't come up with a water quality standard or a water clarity standard. So we can't move forward on a lot of projects if we can't. We really need your help advancing that. And I think I'm totally in agreement with Doug, but it just seems like that is huge. And
I agree, Sarah, and I would be willing to go before the EMC and make that recommendation.
Just from a historical context, we used to do it all the time. It was this committee when I sat on it years ago, not long after it was formulated in the Fisheries Reform Act, routinely requested that the MFC act that way. They send letters, even commentary letters on proposed federal permits and just all kinds of stuff. So they clearly have that authority, and whether with this chairman and the current makeup, they'd be willing to do it. I don't know. I bet they would on this point. Pretty sure. I guess my own thinking, Sarah, is that once we get when will we see that? Is that in August?
See the full presentation? No.
Yeah, we'll be
Yeah,
taking up a lot of your time in August. with this.
I think, Sarah, you and I ought to be prepared, and if we have your general acquiescence to do that, because I think we intend to do that. Ask the chair to write a letter to those, I would say to both commissions, asking their maximum everything.
I think we definitely support that in whatever you add, in that review. Something I would ask is please, aside from, used to be Jesse and now Coral saying, hey, there's a meeting in 2 weeks, give us some more resources. If we're going to be talking about something in as short as 2 weeks, give us 2 months out. Here's some resources for you to study, because I've seen us, when we come to these panels, sometimes not all of us are well prepared, or as knowledgeable on a specific topic. And if you say, hey, we're going to be talking about SAV protection on the next meeting, then feed us with some stuff so we can be as best educated and have the best conversations and recommendations.
And I expect everybody knows, I know for a fact that Glenn does, but the MFC entertains comment the first night on Wednesday and the first thing in the morning on Thursday, and well, at the upcoming August meeting. And you're invited not only as a committee member, but as a representative of the general public to clarify your personal opinions about how important these things are. And as not a private personal privilege, please do. I won't say that.
And I'd like to add to that too, that it's something that I have talked with Jesse at length about more materials that we could have access to, because we don't come to meetings unprepared because we don't care. It's that we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what's out there. And there have been many times where I've stumbled on a paper or a workshop or something that it was incredibly helpful. And I wished that I'd known about it sooner or had enough time to be able to pass that information on to other commissioners. I think it's huge. I think it's really huge. And I think that's something almost in a way that was addressed in the collaboratory report, and it maybe on a higher level, is that sharing of information. I mean, there's just so much incredible brain power in our universities and NOAA here in North Carolina, and we are not always beneficiaries of that information. And I mean, I feel like I've made some poor decisions on the commission for lack of, information. So thank you for bringing that up. Rant over.
I guess the interesting challenge, of course, for the Marine Fisheries Commission in leading on an issue of mutual interest like this is that we always hear we'll find a limited purview of the action of our commission, and yet the other activities under the purview of the other commissions are following later in time. And it's just very hard to take that first step acting in people's perception against watermen of all types, whatever. And they're saying we're a minor part of this problem, water quality, and there's other kinds of direct and indirect habitat destruction activities are the biggest part of this. Why are you coming after us? And so it makes it hard if we don't do it under the aegis of the CHIP. I think is the potential, at least, is supposed to happen. So to me, that's an advantage of laying out the expectation that actions that aren't under the MFC's authority would then need to be addressed. Obviously, statutorily might have to be addressed because it's either what CHIP language is written, not being an attorney. under their purview. And so that intent is to push that all forward and get it done. But for example, should the EMC not act on the water quality standard, they've already put it off again and again. And should they not act, then how can we stand with a straight face and not and claim that those things are going to happen? Other thoughts or opinions, or Nathan, you haven't had a chance to say much. You have things to get on the record.
Well, I did have questions. I mean,
Please.
like you're saying, like we live in a area where we have lots of information, but we don't always know what it is. And I didn't know that the AppNet, I knew this was coming out, this new report. I mean, I'm on the AppNet stack. I should know. But is it out publicly? Is it like published on their website now?
It is out. They put a press release on their website like maybe a few days ago.
Okay, that's fine.
or
I've been
last week.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I've been
Too busy working.
No. I was at
Too busy playing.
playing. Yeah, dollar softball tournament.
World Cup.
No. But but I did have a question about, so you said there's evidence that there was more seagrass decline on the deep edge. And I was curious, like, are there figures or data analysis that clearly shows that there's, I mean, if you see seagrass loss at a deep edge, that's an indication that water quality is a problem. And so if we can see that clearly in the data, then that is an important piece of evidence. That's a smoking gun, exactly.
Yeah.
But is it in there? Because I've been talking to these people and I haven't seen it myself yet. That's what I was.
So I read through the report quickly once, but there was not like a zoom in, like we have the box of you could see it getting patchier over time, right?
Okay.
Like that was pretty clear. The report doesn't include like a zoom in where you can see the deep edge loss or something like that. It states that there's more evidence for that, but it doesn't.
It doesn't.
I'm afraid to speak too specifically to what exactly isn't in there, but they're part of the information that they did say that there was evidence for loss of the deep edge. So, but to your point, that would be a smoking gun.
Yeah, but I mean, to do that, you have to have like good bathymetry maps and then overlay the loss areas and compare the areas you've lost and like across that depth gradient to see if you've. Yeah, it's a complicated analysis
because it's also not like a perfect slant
exactly.
for the next 50 miles.
Exactly.
It's lumpy.
And, and it also changes. Bathymetry changes. Yeah. So I'll just I
think there's some more exploration to be done with the data with regards to that question for sure.
Other thoughts or questions?
I will just say one thing in response to Scotta's, the lack of, preparation materials in this instance is, I think we're viewing it more as kind of priming the committee as a role moving forward so that when we get a draft out to y'all, hopefully very soon, then you can start thinking through, okay, if part of my responsibility is to be coming up with potential protections for SAV and other habitats, what can I be thinking of, and then what can I be reaching out to my user groups to understand and start to bring forward? So in this instance, yes, we didn't provide you with anything, but we're also head down trying to just get it knocked out so that we can get it to you.
Yeah, I'm just referring to the last 5 years of 5+ years of participation on the committee. And there's many times that we'll be, hey, we need to make a proposal or response. And it's like, wow, I didn't study up on that. And I feel bad as my role because I'm not fully versed in the particular topic. So,
and I would also like to say to Zach and Charlie that was not pointed at you. My comment was not pointed at you, and I actually got a sneak peek.
You can point things at us.
Yeah, so.
But I really like the idea involved in recognizing key needs and where pilot projects are needed to vet ideas in order to put them in the toolbox, and then understanding what kinds of policies and programs might be necessary to implement those and adequately analyze and assess those pilot projects, and then also what the issues would be at scale. So where there might be needs for systematic change or programmatic EISs, other kinds of things, and the governance landscape is not likely to change. So we know what those things might be. You can lay out a logical, stepwise approach that would anticipate those needs, because otherwise we solve the first problem, we just run up against the next problem. So I mean, I like what you've done with what you've got. Other thoughts or comments, or recommendations to the staff about what you've heard so far? Anything else you guys want to say or specifically ask? Otherwise, we're going to turn to the public comment if there is any.
Yeah, but if any of you have thoughts that come up later or things you want to express, our emails, I think you have, or if not, we can get them to you, and we're welcome to feedback at any time.
Great. Well, I for one really look forward to seeing both the presentation coming up in August and also the documents. And we'll see. But I think it's a okay. Yeah, okay. No, okay, we'll turn to public comment then, and remember that we'll save the last 5 minutes or so for other issues from you guys. So be thinking about things that you want to put on the table. Okay, so let's turn to public comment. Right now we have 3 people who have asked to speak, and after that we'll make it available to anybody else. I'm not going to put a time limit on you, but if you'll be gentle personally about it and not abuse the privilege, I know you won't. So Glenn, would you like to lead off?
Yeah, I'm Glenn Skinner, commercial fisherman, also executive director of the North Carolina Fisheries Association. And listening to this, I'm a little frustrated that SAB restoration isn't a bigger part of the chip. Protecting what we have is one thing, but we know we're losing 1% a year, and we're not at 100%. We're starting at a significant loss, and that is not sustainable. And neighboring states like Virginia have one of the most successful SAB restoration projects in the world. People in Europe are looking at Virginia, trying to figure out how they've restored eelgrass. And I don't know how many of you know, in 1930, we had a huge plague of wasting disease on the East Coast, killed eelgrass down the entire East Coast. Our bay scallop fishery in North Carolina went from the biggest on the East Coast to virtually nothing. Virginia, bay scallops went extinct. They lost. And they started restoring eelgrass through a really simple process. They go out in the spring and hand harvest seeds. They hold them in tanks in water, and then they just disperse their seeds in the fall. They've restored, last I looked, like 10,000 acres of eelgrass. They took scallops from North Carolina, introduced them, and last year, for the first time in nearly 100 years, Virginia was considering opening a bay scallop season. We've got a bay scallop FMP, has done very little to restore bay scallops. We know there's a direct link between eelgrass loss and bay scallop loss. It's the only fishery in my life I've ever seen where you can look at one thing and say that was it. All our other management plans, we can come up with all kind of theories of what impacted it, but we know what impacted bay scallops. Why in the world hasn't the chip just put this at the forefront? It is such a simple process that they're using. We already have a model that is successful. It's been proven to work. All we need is funding to one or more of our universities, and they could start the following year restoring eelgrass in this state. And I just get frustrated that we look at these broader, big issue items that we know are so hard to tackle when we have this low-hanging fruit, something very simple. We're trying to protect habitat. We're trying to figure out what's happening to it. Why aren't we restoring it? And I would love for this committee to ask the MFC, DMF, whoever it is, to put this at the forefront. If it isn't even in the chip, all we got to do is go to the General Assembly and ask for money. If I understood the gentleman up there right, there won't even be a permitting process for doing it this way. It's simply going out, hand collecting seed, holding it in a tank of water. And to my knowledge, UNC has tested this on a very small scale already. So I get frustrated. The chip is an excellent source stock, but we've done very little to implement all of the stuff that's in the chip. And this would just be so simple if commercial, recreational, regulators, and academia came together and went to Raleigh and said, hey, we need some money to get this done. It's critical habitat. We know it's gonna have benefits and it's proven to work. So I'll leave it at that, but I just think we kind of overlook some of those simple things that we can all work together on.
Thanks, Glenn. That's interesting. I'd love to know what would be involved in establishing a pilot of that type.
Well, I know Joel at the lab, for the last 2 years, he's harvested like over 2 million seeds. And he's been just real nuts and bolts kind of stuff, like how many seeds per meter squared do we need to establish X number of plants? That's the kind of questions they're trying to answer.
And so one of the next questions would be, not to dive into the weeds, the seagrass weeds, but where do you distribute them? And presumably, based on what we've heard before, it would make sense to do that in a place that made sense, and that you had a process for protection or whatever. You know, what would a restoration program look like? What would the pilot sites look like? If it's that straightforward, what would it cost to do it at that scale, at a scale times 10, at a scale times 100?
Doug, if I may interject real quick again, you know, eelgrass, most of you may know this, but you may not. It grows longer blades. It grows in deeper depths of water. The widgeon grass that we have in our state, as sea level rises, it's not going to get the light penetration it needs. Eelgrass can. It can grow up to 6 feet of water. This edge loss that we're seeing, eelgrass could address that issue. As water depth increases, it can reach the surface and get sunlight where other grasses can't. And it's just a no-brainer to me. So
thanks, Glenn. Appreciate your comment. Chris, let's see, Mark, you've already commented. Is that right? Is your name here?
Not Mark.
Mark made this under? Doesn't have a yes or no.
Oh, yeah, she said don't mark yes or no.
Okay, but you've already commented. Chris.
You come up here, I'm not as forceful speaker as my friend, Glenn. And by the way, that's something, the recreational community could get behind as well. My name is Chris Elkins. Thank you for your efforts. And, I'm going to talk a little about food. I'm a typical American. I like food, and I'm around the room. A lot of us like food. But in this case, I'm going to talk about forage fish food. Forage fish and other critters are a critical component of habitat. And I noticed on your slides earlier that you talked a little bit about ecosystem management, which Doug and I are a little bit familiar with the Habitat Committee of South Atlanta. I would point out that in previous CHIPs, I made this comment last year at the beginning of this process. Forage fish was not mentioned in any of them. If you search the documents, it's a major omission. And unfortunately, when I made those comments in front of the commission, they were ignored. So we're all aware of menhaden, which is an important forage fish along the East Coast, often coined the most important fish in the sea, which I don't think it is, but makes the point that everything eats a menhaden. North Carolina was able to eliminate purse seines for menhaden from state waters, and when I was on the commission, we were able to get that passed. No one thinks that's a wrong move. No one wants to go back to purse seining menhaden. And that didn't cost anything, unlike many of the costly habitat restoration programs we talk about. It cost zero. Some of us question whether menhaden are the most important forage fish, especially in the inside waters of North Carolina. Dr. Lewis Daniel, former director of the division, is often cited Atlantic croaker being the most important forage fish in North Carolina, especially the estuaries. But don't take my word or Dr. Daniel, just Google Atlantic croaker as forage fish. That's your homework. Atlantic croaker is forage fish. You'll find a lot of information. Atlantic croaker used to be a huge fishery, colossal. In the 1980s, there were 20 million pounds harvested commercially. Now we're less than 500,000. Atlantic croaker are the largest shrimp trawl bycatch in North Carolina by far. And most are caught inside in the Pamlico Sound. And this comes from EMF, Kevin Brown studies. From Brown studies, one can infer that perhaps 200 million juvenile croakers are killed annually in shrimp trawls in North Carolina. That translates to about 7 million pounds of juvenile croaker killed in shrimp trawls. Thus, on a per weight basis, croaker bycatch presently is 20 times the commercial directed harvest of the adults. 20 times. And it's hundreds by numbers, hundreds of times by numbers. Potentially, that is a lot of forage fish or a lot of croaker harvest that's gone. Now, we can talk about the validity of the numbers and, I'm open to do all that. But these are staggering numbers, the scale. More than ever, we need an onboard observer program for shrimp trawls to resolve some of these several controversies about shrimp trawling and its bycatch. We need to, Kevin's studies were not that extensive, although the South Atlantic has much more data that similar in croaker bycatch. So I know it's late in the process here, and you can't really change it at this point, but I'm hoping that this update is an opportunity to begin the process of addressing forage fish, that issue, including the crash of the croaker population. And so somehow you can work that in as maybe a research recommendation or get the ball rolling. Because remember, when I was advocating for the menhaden reduction fishery, I went to MSC meeting after MSC for 5 years. And it took that long before we were able to, when I got on commission, to get it passed. You got to start somewhere and start small. So again, thank you for your work. And I brought some of, I hear you're all good readers. So
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
It's 2 pages. My stapler crapped out on me halfway through this.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Thanks, sir. John Durham.
I'm so glad I'm not the only person that brought homework. I'm gonna hand out one of these to each of you guys. There was some mention about preparedness, Sarah, up here, we're talking about being prepared for meetings, and you talked about good information. Just to show hands, how many of you guys know who I am and why I was coming here tonight? Anybody?
I think I might, but I'm not sure.
No.
I do not.
No. So I contacted the people that organized and conduct this meeting, made clear to them a particular situation over the previous 2 weeks leading up to this meeting. Had a phone conversation and explained that this is a legitimate issue that I think this committee should hear. And how do I get in touch with them? And I actually have a cousin on this committee I don't think he's here, Bart Durham. Yeah. Oh, that's you. Oh, you are. So you do know. That's why. See, I've never met him but once in my life, I think, but I know he's my cousin. But the people who organized this meeting had a conversation and said, look, my 3 minutes would sure be a lot more valuable if I could preface this by preparing the people I'm coming to speak to, and I could have given you this before I got here. And then I could be a lot more effective because you'd already know why I'm here.
Well, give us the 3-minute summary, and then we'll take 15 minutes each and read your document.
So what I came about is I came upon a blatant violation, a marina that is a member of your Clean Marina program. They're certified by the state as a clean marina. And I was called out there for a septic issue. And long story short, I caught them pumping their septic into Dowry Creek in the Pungo River. I videoed this, captured it all on film. I left the place. I'm a certified septic installer, so I wasn't going to risk getting my credentials on what these people were doing. They were attempting to get me to replace their pump, and I advised the owner that you got to get a pump truck out here and pump this thing out so I can get to the pump. He ended up calling the previous owners of the marina, and the information that came to me was just kind of overwhelming. They've been doing this forever. They called the previous owners. He said, I'm going to call them up and they'll get the auxiliary pump to clear that tank for you. And I thought, that's interesting. I want to see what this auxiliary pump is. And the auxiliary pump is a submersible sump pump they put in there. And they had a permanent stretch of about 100 feet of hose that went out to the marsh adjacent to Dowry Creek and the Pungo River. Documented all this. That's not the most shocking part. The reason I'm here tonight is the response from the people that sponsor your committee. And that's what your homework is here if you want to do it. They basically didn't do anything. They went out there. They said when we got there, they had already had a company come and replace the pump like 2 days later. And that was it. They walked away from it. Now, they never called me back. The gentleman I reported to, and you guys probably, and I don't know David May, never met him in my life, but he runs the office over there in Washington. That's who it was reported to. It takes an incredible amount of energy just to get someone in that office to get on the phone. This is my second go around with them 3.5 years ago trying to get a camera permit. They took contact with the governor's office and a governor's liaison to get that office to call me on the telephone. So I'm not really here about the specific issue of this violation, but what influence you guys can have, because all these plans and regulations and authorities that you guys can put together, if the body's responsible for administering and enforcing this are impotent, then what you guys are doing is it doesn't count for a lot. And that's where I'm at. I put my business on the line to report this. Some people recommended me to do it. I wasn't going to do it because I work in that community all the time. And about half of them have patted me on the back. The other half have said, we'll never do business with you again because you're a rat. I'm a rat now, guys, for doing what some people in your organization would say I should have done, I think. So what I want you guys to do is take this and read it. I've given you an address stamped envelope. I've given you a public information request. This is asking for, we want to know, and this is what bothers me about it. Did they, their explanation, the best I could get from Mr. May was, look, we didn't catch it red-handed. Well, I gave you the video. I told you who I am. I saw it, and I've come forward. And the next question was, well, did you go take any samples? Because you can go to that marsh right now, and the fecal coliform will be off the charts. Absolutely off the charts, beyond anyone's reasonable explanation, except somebody's dumping sewage in here. And wow, here's a video of the guy following the hose and picking it up and going, wow, look at that, that's raw sewage. I mean, this is all, David May called this the Holy Grail. He said, that's the Holy Grail of capturing it. Well, you sure dropped the Holy Grail and walked away from it. So you guys can, I was a director of an NGO up in the upstate of South Carolina, Clean Water, Tiger and Reed River Alliance, for about 5 years. I'm familiar with how some of this stuff works. It takes pressure from the right group, sometimes more than one group. It takes the NGOs. It takes committees like yours. The people that get in those jobs, unfortunately, those levels. And again, nothing personal. I don't know them. And I don't really, it's been 15 years since I was involved in any of this, and I do not want to be involved with it and regret that I ever made the phone call on this. But it's so egregious and, so irresponsible of the people that we pay to take care of these things that I had to come here tonight. Not only you, but there's some other committees that are gonna hear about this too. If we cannot hold a man accountable for intentionally and blatantly pumping his raw sewage out into these, directly in these marshes you guys were talking about right there. Everything you guys are talking about tonight, we caught that red-handed and your people walked away from it. So
I see a question for you.
Sure.
From Lisa.
Can I address it? I'm with Coastal Carolina River Watch, and we report violations similar to this, other instances where we catch folks red-handed all the time.
Sure.
Unfortunately, it does have to be a state person that catches someone red-handed. So we can document it all day long. They still have to send someone out there and document themselves. But however, I did want to just say, there's someone that's local to your area is going to be Katie Zimmerman. She's the water keeper that services your area. She works for Sound Rivers.
Sure.
She can certainly have someone come out and start to take samples in this area.
Right.
That can help you build a case for what you're looking at doing. But unfortunately,
I don't want to build, again, I did this a long time ago and the work you're talking about, I admire you a lot. I
Right.
did it. It's a lot of work. I don't want to build that case. There's someone that I pay to build that case. The taxpayers pay someone to build that case, and that's what I'm getting at. The people who were supposed to build that case, they didn't investigate it. And I understand what you're saying, that they're saying that the person would be there. I don't quite buy that. When you have the video evidence, you have people coming forward and say, I'm a witness to it. You have other tools at your disposal to go take those samples and see what is there. I can't accept that we're saying we can't enforce that. If that's the state of things, then you guys need to change your agenda. Let's change the state of that, because that's unacceptable. Again, I'm certified and trained by the state. The state has told me what I'm supposed to do when I encounter that as a certified septic guy. I know what I'm liable for. And so I'm trained to do that in my profession, getting away from, I know the other side of this that he's explained too. I do understand that. I've been there. But again, I came here tonight. There's probably one more committee I'm going to present this to. You guys can do with it what you may. But again, just bring it to your attention. Without the apparatus and that arm that actually effectuates what it is that you guys are working on and saying, we got to do this, we got to do that, we got to make that right. If we're still at the point where people are allowed to literally pump their septic tank out into the wetlands, and the organization that sponsors this meeting literally, and that's what's here, is the public records request, because what you're gonna find out when you send this in is what I told you. There's nothing there. You're gonna see one visit to the site and some emails from me, and that's all. That's literally all it is. There is no. So all the questions are there asking, because I already looked up the designated shoreline classification and all that stuff. But in that request is all of that information, the designated shoreline areas, and it is secondary. It's secondary contact waters adjacent to primary contact waters where this was going out. And then there's also requests for, and this is a big one, the clean marina stuff. This got called in on these people. What happened to what is this clean? Is it just a feel good, happy thing that you gave a little gold star and then you walk away from it and nothing ever happens? That's what it looks like. If the clean marina gets called in for this, something's got to happen. There has to be something there. Then aside from the clean marina, again, was there any investigation at all? Was there a single sample taken at that location? Again, because it's going to the marsh and then going through the water, that water, as well as the marsh, could have easily been sampled. And here again, this is a month later. I guarantee it's teeming with fecal coliform today. So these things can and should be done. And
thanks,
yes,
Mr.
that's
Darrell.
what I
Appreciate your time coming in.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna make sure. Yes, one of you on the committee.
Yes, sir. I think Ms. Ryder was trying to help you.
Well, so there's a comment in one of those emails, and I asked the gentleman, the owner of that place, one of the questions I asked him at the end of our conversation, I looked at him and some of the papers, I said, do y'all want to do 6 o'clock news? Because the ITN had just reported all the beach closings and swimming closures because of fecal coliform had just been on the news that day. They would have loved to have gone out there. Not only that, they would have loved to go over to David May's office and ask David about his actions. And I'm sure they would love to camp out over in Washington until somebody came to the door.
Well, thank you for your time and your concern, Mr. Durham. We really
Okay,
appreciate
I
it.
get it. Shut up and get out.
So if you don't mind, can we talk after the meeting?
Excuse me?
If you don't mind, can we also talk after the meeting?
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, you got one.
Yes, thank you.
I mean,
guys
there
are on
are
the
some
committee,
interesting
right?
systematic
We're-
issues.
Yeah, but we got a couple of missing committee members.
What the Marine Patrol, the enforcement officers under our aegis can't do related to enforcement of non-marine fisheries commission rules and regulations, which I don't know and should know. So maybe you can help us think through those kinds of more generic issues later. Okay, round robin issues on the table before we adjourn, things that we have or haven't talked about, you'd like to know more about in future meetings?
Yes, actually, someone mentioned a presentation from APNEP on their recent paper. I think that's a great idea, especially considering what we have coming up ahead of us. And then I know this is gonna be probably well out in the future, but potentially some prep for the upcoming EMC meeting once it gets on the agenda.
Okay, anybody else?
I got
That's a
something
good idea.
Yeah, if you don't mind. I
Please.
just wanted to address the last comment. We received an email from Mr. Durham to Division of Marine Fisheries. Appreciate your email and your concerns. We took that email, we provided that to the director, the deputy directors for Division of Water Resources. Richard Rogers responded to my email with some information. They are planning on reaching out to you to discuss that situation. So just didn't want this group to feel that information coming to the division wasn't being provided to the correct groups that are responsible for the water resources, right? So we have done that. They're in communication with us. They indicated they would reach out to you and discuss that situation as well. So just wanted to, put that in front of you.
Great, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Anybody else?
I want, just for like business in the meetings, sometimes like we go around this round robin for things to be included within the statement and it's not included within our minutes. So, if as it's being recorded, if it can be translated as, so your comments, my comments would remain within there. Sometimes they don't stay with it or get formally recorded,
Okay.
as.
Well, when you see things like that, please bring them either to my attention or the staff's, or for that matter, even frankly, post on it after the fact, if there are things that should have been included, even if we've already voted. I purposefully give that largesse just to make sure that if there's something really important that gets omitted, that I expect you to bring it either to me or the staff.
And then, please, if, we get a lot of presentations and say, hey, you got our emails, we don't have your emails. I know who you are and you could dig through and find it, but if that could be included in some form of minutes as it's, hey, these folks gave a presentation, here's their contact info, as we would have comments, so we could reach out.
That's great. Anybody else? Good. Well, I'm looking forward to when is our next meeting approximately?
December or October.
Okay, so at that time, the August meeting will have happened. And so
Yeah.
Yes.
what do you think the agenda is likely to include at that time? We're given that process.
Yes, so we will at least be coming back to you to get additional feedback on anything else in the chip. We will be giving you written chapters beforehand, and we will try to also make a summary that's distilled. This chip will be shorter than the past ones, but it'll still be dense. So we will try to make it approachable. We'll also be kind of broadcasting a little more widely for broader public input as well.
You'll be looking for comment from the body as a whole, but in terms of individual comments, marks up and things like that. You want those?
If you guys wanna go for it, then I am welcome to.
Okay.
I'll send it out to you, and you give me lineups if you want.
Okay. Okay, that's great. Good. Well, without any other observations or comments, we'll declare this meeting to be adjourned. With another thanks to each of you for coming and to the people participating, commenting and all. Thank you.
September 16th looks like the next Habitat meeting.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Thank you.
The Croker information, coming around.
That's actually one of mine.